Okay, so Matt, no pressure, but we were talking offline about you have like a larger than life personality, at least on in the interwebs. um, I'm very excited for today because I love the energy that you bring in your YouTube videos and everything else, and I think it's something that our listeners will be so drawn to. But I'm also just so drawn to your story, and I think you just have a great one to tell that I think people will like. So you have built this great business, but you started as a solopreneur. And I want to know, like, what challenges did you face when you began your real estate business, and how did you overcome them to be at the success level you are today?
Sure. Well, actually, I haven't always been in real estate. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I spent probably the next 15 years of my life in the music business. And I had a small little hip hop label, and it was a label all by myself. I had made my own little records, and I put them in the back of my car, and I'd drive from store to store to store. That was a while ago when they had music stores. And I'd put the records on consignment. I was in Southern California, so I'd start in Los Angeles. And I'd drive up to all the way, hit all the music stores between Los Angeles and San Francisco, then all the way through the Inland Empire, and all the way down to San Diego, and all the way back up. And that was like a week-long route. And once I got back, it was time to go back again to see what it actually sold, collect my funds, and do that around and around and around. So I did that for several years, and as just a one-man operation. And then I got an offer from EMI. I had made enough noise with just what I've been doing by myself that they gave me this massive global distribution deal. And again, I mean, I was a solopreneur for probably a year into that, and then had a few employees, but they were really just my buddies, and we were just working together. And, so I made my millions before I was 30. And then this thing called the digital download came along and turned the whole industry upside down. People stopped going to music stores. They started downloading it and everything. And in hindsight, it's crystal clear what happened. But at the time it was happening, I mean, we didn't have the internet as we know of it right now, and the way social media is, and the way that news proliferates so quickly. But I mean, within 6 months, I was out of business, and the money stopped rolling in, and the wife left, and she left me with all of her debt. And then so I had to file bankruptcy. That was in 2001. And I found myself at the age of 34 having to start life completely from scratch, and went out into the job world and found out that I didn't have the credentials to qualify to even interview for stuff. So I looked into selling insurance, and I was selling cars. I went through a number of multi-level marketing type things to really try and find my place. Ended up bagging groceries, and was just like, oh my God, how did I end up here? And I really missed my money, because I really missed my lifestyle. And of all the people, the most unlikely mentor was the grocery store manager, who was also 34 years old. So we were the same age, but he was managing the store and I was pushing the carts. And he had said, Matt, let me tell you something about money. And I was like, okay, because I was all ears at that point in my life, because he certainly had a whole lot more than me. He says, real estate, it's the final frontier where the average person has a legitimate shot at creating real wealth. Let me show you what I've done. And so he'd been there 18 years. So he was 34. He started working there. He was 36 in high school. And he was going to retire in the next 2 years. He'd be able to pull 70% of his full salary as his pension. But he says, look what I've done along the way. I've picked up a couple apartment buildings, and they produce enough cash flow where that's going to exceed what I get from my pension. And I was like, wow. And so that night I grabbed a bottle of wine after work and went home and did everything on Google about real estate, and found out that I had an estranged aunt. I hadn't seen her probably 15, 16 years. She was the number one real estate agent about just 2 cities over. And so at that point, the wine was gone, and I was loaded with liquid courage. So I fired off an email to her, and in the morning she had responded, and we had lunch that day. And within 24 hours, I was in real estate agent school. And so that's how I got into real estate. It was really kind of an accident, a very whimsical, spontaneous thing.
Now, what year was this?
That would have been 2002, 2003.
Okay, so you had some runway before the crash. Okay.
Yeah, I did. And it's funny, the crash didn't affect me at all. And I can tell you about that if you want. But, for about 3 or 4 years, I was an agent. And then I had 2 clients that were just, amazing. If any agent would be hearing this story, like, yes, that's the type of client I want. I mean, they'd fax in their offers, they'd fax in their listings. We used to use fax machines. That's showing us back a little bit. But it was just great. I just processed paperwork and made these big fat commissions. I was working in Palos Verdes, California. And, the smallest house there is $1 million. So you didn't have to sell that many to do really well for yourself.
Right.
And then just one day, there was one Saturday, is the pivotal moment. And I had a meeting with them. It was like 10:30 in the morning on a Saturday. And I showed up in my suit and tie, had all their documents laid out on the table, ready to go ahead and facilitate the next transaction or whatever it was that we were meeting on. And they showed up 20 minutes late. They were in jeans and a t-shirt. They signed all their paperwork and took off for the weekend. And I was left to work. I was left there to hold their house open and process all their paperwork. I was like, you know what? If real estate is where all the money's at, I think I'm just sitting on the wrong side of the desk. Because I started to compare commissions to what profits were. And so I had made a decision almost immediately to never represent another person in a transaction again, and only to act on my own behalf. And so I made a huge investment in a real estate investing education. And, that was kind of, the rest was history. I just did what they told me to do. And again, a one-man operation for a good 4 or 5 years. I ran across this little book. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. It's called Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Oh, yeah.
That small thing?
That small little thing. But it introduced me to two things that rightly I hadn't ever been taught before. One was a new definition of wealth, right? So you needed to have, rather than having a bunch of money in the bank, which is what my definition of wealth was when I was in the music business. And, but that definition of wealth was just to have enough passive income each month to cover your monthly expenses. And that was totally different, a way of thinking about it. And then that whole concept of passive income would be the second thing.
That blew me away too. That whole redefinition of what it means to be wealthy was completely life-changing for me.
Yep, absolutely. And we speak English, and I can take the word passive and I take the word income. I can put them together and kind of figure out what it means. But to be taught it as an actual intention was that was mind-blowing. And so within 3.5 years, I was able to suppress my expenses down low as I could, and then got my passive income to exceed that. And I was free. Now, I didn't have my money back, but I had experienced both definitions of wealth. And I got to tell you, the second one was actually the better one.
You have to drive around all week, pitching your albums.
Yeah, so I retired for about 30 days. And, when you do that, I think it was 39 or 40 years old when I did that. And, you can only watch so many movies. You can only go to the gym so many times. You can only hit so many golf balls. And then you can only go to so many happy hours before that daily routine gets kind of old. And then what you also discover is that you're doing it alone all the time, because everyone that your age has to work, And so then we kind of corrected course and went deeper into the real estate, and then we started teaching it as well.
Yeah.
So Matt, let me ask you this, because you were talking about passive income, and I think that's very appealing to so many solopreneurs. But you also talked about a big investment, and you put in this big investment and then kind of saw it grow from there. Where do you recommend people start with passive income that don't have the capital for that big investment?
The internet has made so many different options available to people. So with that book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, it was very much, the difference between the way the rich and the poor think, but it was pretty real estate centric, right? And I kind of take what I learned in that book, and then what my grocery store manager told me, this is the final frontier where the average person has a legitimate shot at creating real wealth. And at that point in my life, I was feeling far below average. So I was like, who am I to aspire above that? So there's the real estate aspect of it. I think that's, even if you just did one house every other year on the side while you did your full-time something else, you're going to be miles ahead of everybody else that follows this traditional path of investing in the stock market, max out your 401k. If you do the math, it's no comparison. But when I kind of reached that, I went to this seminar. It was about creating passive income. And I was looking okay, now I need to diversify. I got a good thing going with the real estate. Let me go and diversify. And the whole thing turned out to be about membership websites. So you have a little website, and, and they said, wealthy people are wealthy because they figure out how to do one thing really good, and then they create multiple streams of income from that knowledge. And so the next logical progression for most people is to go out and be some sort of consultant or educator or trainer. And so kind of taking those two ideas, and so taking your knowledge and putting it behind a paywall, I think that's a form of passive income that I think also anybody can do, because everybody is good at something, right? And there's somebody that is not as far along as you are, and they'll pay you for that information. Whether that's a $50 a month, $100 a month, or $50,000 a year. There is a value for that in the marketplace. So I think that's a really good place for most people to start, is like, what do I know, right? And what could I share, and what would people want to pay me for?
I do want to hear about how you weathered the storm during the recession, because I think a big question that solopreneurs have is just like, when you're on your own, the ebbs and flows of not having that salaried paycheck. But as you were saying, passive income is nice to support your daily costs. But how did you weather that storm? And what advice would you have for people to deal with the ebbs and flows?
I've been thinking about that a lot over the last couple of years, really, of why 2008 wasn't so devastating to me. And I think we were just, for one reason, we were living in different times, to where I didn't know it was a bad thing. I didn't really have a point of reference. I was like, okay, the market just changed, so we changed our strategy. And I did very, very well during that part. I mean, I had a little speed bump like everybody else, where it slowed down. But by 2009, mid-2009, I was in full steam ahead, making more money than I've ever made. And I think by not having access to information all day long, every second of the day, I think it can be really beneficial. So I've been on it since the last election was at 2020. I've been on a news diet ever since. I was like, I can't go through that again. And so I just don't pay attention. I just find that I have no idea what's going on right now. And I just feel so much more at peace. So I think that's one thing.
But can I ask a question on that before? So, you say you didn't really notice it, but like, so many people in 2008 wound up with vacant homes. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm assuming you're doing residential, or you're doing homes and apartment buildings?
Well, here's the distinction with, I think with that. The people who lost really big were the fix and flippers. And they were the ones that had, you could buy a house, pay full retail this month, and sell it for 20% more 3 months later, 4 months later, right? So you didn't have to even be good at finding deals. Like, the market would just like rescue you from your ignorance and your incompetence.
Riding the curve, I call it.
Totally. And what did you call it?
Riding the curve, riding the wave.
Mm-hmm. And it was a big wave. So if you were in it, then it was carrying you really far. And I think where people really got hurt was, well, if I did one this month and I made such and such, what if I did two? What if I did three? What if I did four? And then money was so easy to come by. The banks were just throwing it at people. So those that had 4, 5, 6 flicks and flips going on at the same time, which was a lot of people, that's who got really hurt when all of a sudden those houses weren't worth more than, they were worth less than what they paid for them.
Right.
And then the builders, of course, they overbuilt, and then they couldn't sell them to do that. So yeah, the market was flooded with inventory. But if you bought right and you weren't over leveraged, your income properties that I had, and mine were in middle America. They were Danville, Illinois, and Memphis.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. So you weren't in California.
Yeah. I mean, it was really tough to cash flow in California. So after reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad, like, California was kind of like a no-go zone because you couldn't cash flow. It was all speculation. And so in those middle America areas, the market crash didn't really hit as hard, right? The prices didn't fall as much.
Right. Yeah.
The job loss was minimal. So the tenants stayed. So I didn't really have there wasn't a big impact for me during that period.
Now, how did you make that passive income, since it was, 1,000, 1,500 miles from where you lived? How did you make that passive, as opposed to you being there fixing the toilets?
Right. Yeah. No. And I've never fixed a toilet, by the way. In fact, if you put a wrench in my hand, it'd be very dangerous, mostly to myself. But it's relationships, really, and I don't want to just kind of use that as this big general statement. But there's property managers out there, and that manage properties for a living, and I had to rely on them because I was 6, 7 states away. And so I just became really good at managing property managers. And that's how I was able to make it happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask, and this is when I was like, I don't know which question to ask first. What role did your mental state have on all of this? You were saying, you were like, at the time when I was 34, I felt like I was below average. And you had that feeling. Did just a shifted mindset help with things as well? Or what role did that play in your success?
I think having been at the grocery store for about 6 months and, feeling really lousy and really depressed and like, how did I end up here? And I'm bagging groceries and, I was in the town that I went to high school in, and my high school sweetheart comes through the checkout line and I was sitting there going, paper or plastic. I mean, that'll really beat you down mentally. And so once I went through kind of 6 months of that, I was, I think I was only ready to go up from there. So I think if I would have made the transition straight from the music business where I had a big bank account over to real estate to where I didn't have a big bank account, that might have been really tough. But I went down so far and so low and had a real attitude adjustment imposed upon me that, it was like, okay, here we go. 34 is not that old, even though I just turned 55. And I think how ridiculous it was when I was 34 years old and I thought I was like past my prime, you know, and I remember being depressed about that. But I was like, wow, if I guess mentally what the real shift was, what happens if I don't do anything? What happens if I just stay the course and do what I'm doing right now? Where will I be in 5 years? And the thought of that terrified me. So that was enough to get me into action and say, hey, I know 5 years is going to pass whether I get to work or not. So where do I want to be when that 5 years does pass?
Yeah, it's a great point. Well, so I also wanted to circle back. You were saying that after your 30 days of retirement and there are only so many happy hours and everything, you decided to just kind of expand and go from there. So what advice do you have for solopreneurs who want to scale their business without losing control of the current operations that are working?
Mm-hmm. I think because I've had a big business and our business was as big as it's ever been just before COVID. And it was very much a live event business. And, that's probably the worst time ever in history to have a live event business when they shut the world down. But
help me understand, what was a live event business? The education?
Yeah, the education aspect.
Oh, so you were doing that live. Okay.
Yeah, and we do it every single week. It was very capital intensive. The margins are very, very small. I know people think that the guru that comes to town, they're making all this money because they're selling this stuff for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a package. And it's like, no, the margin is super small because you're jumping from market to market, and amount of money has to be spent to get people actually in the audience. And then you got 14, 15 people on the team. So you got plane tickets every single week. You got hotel rooms. The margin is really small. And so that's kind of leading me to this point that when COVID caused us to reset everything, it was like, okay, let's just keep it really, really small and let's see how we can scale this. And I think just, again, with the internet and everything that's available and so many different services out there available, I think it's really easy for a solopreneur just to kind of delegate stuff. I mean, if you look at somebody like, there was a story about Kylie Jenner, the youngest billionaire ever. And essentially, she just came up with ideas and outsourced everything, and she sat at the top and called the shots. But it used to be like the idea was the execution was the real value in building a business. But now you can outsource the execution. Now the real value is in coming up with the right idea. So I think...
And the branding, I think.
Totally. The branding helps for sure. But I mean, there's a bunch of, e-commerce entrepreneurs that are making millions that you've never heard of. So you can outsource and delegate a lot of the execution. And I think that makes it easier for solopreneurs than ever.
Well, so speaking of branding, you were talking about getting people in the seats, what marketing advice would you give solopreneurs that helped you grow your business when you were in their shoes?
Well, in hindsight, I mean, I don't know if I can give advice, but in hindsight, what got us to where we are was I started my podcast in 2009 when I had to explain to every single person that I told what I did. I had to explain to them what a podcast was, right? And they didn't know. And it's like, so I would just say, it's like an on-demand radio show. And they'd be like, oh, okay. Well, who listens to that? And I was like, well, people do, right? So getting in that early, I think, had a significant impact. And I wish I would have known the value of it then because I didn't take it that seriously. But, that just created such a following when we would do our live events, especially for the first 4 or 5 years. We did no advertising at all. We just say, hey, we're going to be in Tampa this weekend. Come out and see us. And people would just show up, and they would show up like fans. Like, it was like a weird thing because, if they would have seen me when I was recording my podcast then, I'm in my underwear in my closet where all the clothes were so it wouldn't echo, right? And just a little laptop and a small little microphone. And that's what the podcast was at that time. And, when you come out into the real world and meet the people that are listening, you had no idea who was listening and the impact that you were having. But I think what really I noticed was, and I heard this over and over and over again, so people say, oh my gosh, you're the same in person as you are on the podcast. So I think as you're building a brand, the authenticity and just being yourself, even if you don't like who you are, there are other people out there just like you that will like you. So like, not trying to please everybody and just being yourself and not being afraid to voice an opinion and have a voice. And I think that's really important to building a brand. And if you look at the people that are really big, I guess some people it's difficult to tell whether they're faking it or not unless you met them in real person. But they're just very consistent with who they are. And those seem to be the ones that get the most traction from their brand.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would be very surprised to see Joe Rogan not be like Joe Rogan in real life. I'm not saying I love everything about the guy, but he comes off as authentic for sure. So it's, I think that's a really great piece of advice to just, be you.
And I'm a big fan of Gary Vee. And I think he's absolutely right that if you don't have brand, you don't have anything in the way that the world is moving. And so I think building your brand, like picking one platform and just getting good at that one platform before ever going to the next one, I think is a really good way to start. So whether that is a podcast and, we ventured off in YouTube and that took off really well, but I've never been good on Instagram ever. And, in fact, I've been shut down.
It's our generation.
Yeah. And then I just started posting. I was starting, when I got into the YouTube shorts because our YouTube channel is so much stronger. And so I would just automatically post the YouTube channel. The shorts would automatically get fed over to a TikTok feed that we had at my TikTok channel. And all of a sudden I have 40,000 people over there. But I have nobody on Instagram. So I don't know why one works and why one doesn't, but,
nobody does.
Just pick one and get good at it.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about diversifying our marketing and everything, but what advice would you have for solopreneurs who want to diversify their income streams, but are kind of afraid to take that leap?
Yeah, I think diversification is really good. I mean, and there's also two schools of thought on it, right? It represents some security and some comfort. But it also can, for an entrepreneur-minded person, that shiny object syndrome could get in the way to where you're not very good at any of those incomes, right? And I think in hindsight, I would go really, really deep with one and get that up and running to the point where it's boring. Warren Buffett says the best investing is boring investing. And Alex Hormozi kind of has had a version of that recently in his message, that you want to get so good at business, at your one core business, that it is boring. And, once just getting like to a mediocre level where it's generating some money and then going to look for something else, I don't think it produces the same result. I think you should get really good at one and then figure out the second one after the one could work with or without.
Great advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Filled with so much good advice. So I have a question that is not your expertise. You're going to have to pick somebody else's favorite advice. What is your favorite quote about success?
There are so many amazing quotes. I'm kind of a quote junkie, but I think Mark Twain has a great one, as he has many. But learn from other people's mistakes because you won't be here long enough to make them all on your own.
Love that. Yeah, it's so true. All right, another bumper sticker to add to the list, Joe. Well, Matt, this has been so wonderful. I love to hear your story. I just think you have so many nuggets of wisdom for people. If people want to follow your YouTube channel or learn more about you, where can they find you?
Yes, we're on YouTube as Epic Real Estate. The podcast is the longest running real estate investing podcast on the internet. And that's at epicrealestateinvesting.com. And then our website is Epic Real Estate. And then I just came out with a book, a brand new book. It's my flagship book. So you can get a copy of that at myescapebook.com. And it's not a real estate book. It's a money book disguised as a real estate book, just because of all the wealth building qualities that real estate does. I mean, you can check so many boxes by just buying an income property once every other year. And I'm not an agent, so I'm not going to make any money on whether you do or not, but it's just a thing that I can see in our society and the way that money works. I think it's something that everybody needs to look into at least a little bit.
Yeah. Great advice. Everybody be sure to go check that out, and congratulations on that. And we can't thank you enough for coming on. This has been great.
It has been. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and listeners, we are sure you will agree with that. I haven't had my coffee this morning, but you know the drill. Please give us a 5-star review, give us a comment, subscribe to our YouTube and our podcast on any of your favorite platforms. We so appreciate it, and we will see you next time on the Aspiring Solopreneur.